As Emisi said, my name's Arthur. I'm a grad student at Wayne State. I'm also the chair of policy and political education for Detroit chapter of BYP 100. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about surveillance and containment. So this will be kind of a two-part discussion. First, I want to build up with the history of surveillance of communities of color in the United States, just to kind of provide a framework and a background for what we're going to be discussing later. And then we will jump right into how the long history of mass surveillance in America, specifically targeted against Black folks, against brown folks, against Native folks, ties into what is happening in the city of Detroit today. Okay. So, I've given this presentation a couple times now, and I pretty much always lead with the same question. How many people in this room, by a show of hands, have heard of a organization called COINTELPRO? Okay. Less than usual. Good. Okay. So, does anyone in the room want to give like a brief definition? What was COINTELPRO? Yes. Yep, that's pretty much it. So the gentleman said COINTELPRO was a counterintelligence program. It was started by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, which at the time was headed by this ugly individual up top, J. Edgar Hoover. And it was essentially started for the purpose of dismantling the civil rights movement, and then the Black Power movement, as it was epitomized by the Black Panther Party in the late '60s and early 1970s. And so that pretty much gives us, a starting point for modern mass surveillance in the United States. It was basically COINTELPRO. Most of these mass surveillance programs were originally devised for the purpose of taking down large-scale Black activist movements. All the technology, all of the policies, all of this stuff was basically invented for that purpose. And then, not only Black movements, but as other movements emerged, like Native Power, like Yellow Peril, they also, initiated lots of mass surveillance on them as well. So there are a few quotes on here that pretty much sum it up. Steeped in its own racism, without any checks or balances, the FBI devoted more resources to harming the civil rights movement than any other task in its purview. That's a quote from the Daily Beast. And they were also obsessed with monitoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from the mid-1950s until his assassination in 1968. So the first two quotes are, about the history 50 years ago. And the last one pretty much shows that as far as the surveillance of, Black activists for the purpose of dismantling Black activist movements, this stuff is still very much so going on. The Federal Bureau of Investigation recently, as in maybe 2015, created a category of domestic terrorists in the United States called Black Identity Extremists, or Black Identity Extremist movements. And essentially what it is just categorizing Black Lives Matter, our organization, Black Youth Project 100, and just the movement for Black lives generally as a terrorist group. And, basically saying that we view the unjust murders of Black people at the hands of police as an impetus to attack police officers or whatever. So basically, you know, modern mass surveillance in the USA began with the surveilling of Black activists, and it continues with the surveilling and containment of Black activists. Sure. Sure. So it says the 12-page report. This is the original report about that the FBI released on Black identity extremism. It says the 12-page report announces the existence of the Black identity extremist movement and deems it a violent threat, asserting that Black activists' grievances about racialized police violence and inequalities in the criminal justice system have spurred retaliatory violence against law enforcement officers. Because we all know that's true. Okay. But honestly, Black activists were only, even though it really started with the surveilling of Black activists, um, it this is only one group of people who were surveilled quite heavily around this time period. And really, I think you can kind of summarize, surveillance in America as being like, well, we feel the need to watch any marginalized community, any community that exists, on the margins of society has been deemed foreign or un-American. And we feel the need to watch and contain them because they are fundamentally a threat. So another, group of folks who both fall under the umbrella of Black activists, but also under the umbrella of queer and transgender activists, um, that the FBI targeted heavily were people like Marsha P. Johnson. Um, does anybody in the room know who Marsha P. Johnson was? Can I get a show of hands? Who all knows who Marsha P. Johnson was? Okay. Can somebody tell me, just real quick, what was Marsha P. Johnson responsible for? What did she do? Yes. Yes, thank you. So Marsha P. Johnson was, as the gentleman said, a lead organizer in organizing resistance against the raid at Stonewall, which was basically the beginning of the modern LGBTQ movement. So Marsha P. Johnson was also a Black trans woman, and around the same time that the FBI was heavily targeting, monitoring Black activists, they were really heavily targeting and monitoring anybody who they deemed un-American. And this included queer folks, transgender folks, like Marsha and like Sylvia Rivera, who was pictured to her right. Um, and, from way back then to now, there has always been a tendency of law enforcement to specifically target trans women of color, and to target them on the basis of them being suspected sex workers, and to try to round them up and incarcerate them on that basis. So a lot of the harassment that folks were facing back in the 60s and early 70s, as a result of the surveilling of their communities was, because the police suspected that they were doing sex work, they were using illicit drugs and that sort of thing. And so the police basically profiled and harassed them for years, up until it really exploded into the rage of the Stonewall Rebellion. And, a huge, huge part of this profiling was surveillance, just watching queer and trans communities in, in urban areas like New York City and Chicago and Detroit, 24/7. So now let's kind of fast forward about 20 years or so to the foundations of the modern surveillance state. So back when the FBI was, watching the Black Panther Party, the way that they watched them was like really, shall we say, low tech, analog. They basically had people in cars, just camped out outside of folks' houses, watching their comings and goings and recording them. And that was basically how they watch people. They also occasionally tapped your phone, but there was nowhere near these sort of high tech efforts that you could use to watch people then that there is now. And actually, a substantial amount of the technology that is used to surveil folks really was developed via the war on drugs. Um, so, and that's pretty much detailed in this quote. The war on drugs is sometimes overlooked as also having played a key role in the erosion of our privacy rights. It is a war that takes place not on some foreign battlefield, but in the lives of Americans, their homes, the cars, phones, purses, and bodies. And in fighting this war, the authorities have found justification for extending their power into all such realms. So, beginning in the uh, early 1980s with Ronald Reagan's presidency and continuing up to today, there's been just an explosion of monitoring of people. And, in the early 80s, it was essentially all in the name of fighting drug dealers and drug traffickers, which, as we all know, has long been code for Black people and brown people. So you can see from this graph that the number of drug wiretaps over the last 25 years went from about 800 to about 4,000, nearly 500% increase. And there's a huge disparity in the amount of drug wiretaps versus other wiretaps. Drug wiretaps are the ones that dramatically increase, while other wiretaps for other crimes like, let's say, murders or something like that basically remained the same from 1989 to 2013. So you can see from this is basically a visual representation of how the war on drugs dramatically expanded the surveillance state. And in that time, you also saw the rise of so-called sneak and peek searches, which is, basically the police searching you without any real probable cause, but in the name of like, okay, we suspect that this person might be a drug dealer or a trafficker. So based on our suspicion, we can search them. Prescription databases, which monitor the prescribing of prescription drugs. The monitoring of financial activity. So everybody in here knows you can't send over $10,000 out of the United States, right? If you were to just try to send 10 grand to Libya tomorrow, I guarantee you there will be a federal agent at your door, and that person will ask you, what is this 10 grand that you sent to Libya about? The reason for that, it was not always this way. The reason for that is because the war on drugs pretty much made it so that it was legal for the government to monitor people's financial activity, which was pretty unprecedented for that time. And also, this is where we saw GPS devices the legal precedents began to be established for GPS devices being put on people's cars as a way of tracking them, and also aerial monitoring. So, when a crime is committed and the police are like flying around, shining lights on people, all of this stuff is really no more than 30 years old, 40 years old. I put this there because this is my absolute favorite TV show. Anybody seen The Wire? Oh, yes. Okay, wonderful. You know, you guys know how like maddening it was for them when they just, they always had to like use the right payphone because they never knew who was listening. And low key, I was always on their side, not the cops. So another thing that was really initiated by the war on drugs was what I like to call the Child Protective Services reign of terror, which is, when everyone was so shocked that Cheeto Benito was separating families at the border, I was personally, I mean, of course, I was shocked by that. Of course, that was horrifying and that was very evil to me. But another thing, another, emotion that dredged up for me, and I'm sure a lot of people in this country, was it's interesting that everybody is outraged about this now because CPS has been separating black and brown families for years upon years. And it really started with the war on drugs again. Um, you pretty much have, even now, a kind of law of suspects, right? Where, if you people say stuff to you like if you see something, say something. If you see suspected abuse or neglect, then you have a number, and of course, police or CPS agents directly can come to that person's house, pop up on them, and potentially take their children. Again, it really wasn't always this way. All of the legal precedents for separating people's families on the basis of abuse or neglect really kind of came about with the war on drugs, because the war on drugs also resulted in the rise of the, the vilification of the black mother. And like Reagan famously says that she was welfare queen driving Cadillac. That sort of ideology that black and brown mothers were neglectful and abusive, and that they needed to have more social control put on them, was really something that came about in this era. And that now continues in even more horrifying ways with immigration and customs enforcement and stuff like that. But I'm not just here to talk to you about surveillance, right? I'm also here to talk about containment. So let's talk about it. How does surveillance ultimately lead to oppression, right? What is the connection between those two things? Well, I think that we can see it with two things: these quotes and this picture of this young girl. So the quote is from an article that I found on WDIB Detroit, Channel 4, where they were talking about the Detroit Police Department's camera system throughout the city. And what it says is Detroit Police have a high-tech center which is filled with video feeds from cameras all over the city, some in the open and others that are in secret locations, and they're used to catch criminals in the act, according to Detroit Police. And there is another quote from a DPD officer who kind of is a part of the technological operations of the Real Time Crime Center, where he says when an officer arrives at a scene, he receives updated information about the address. So if there's a person in the home that's known to be a violent person who is suffering from any kind of mental incapacitation, that is known to be violent or aggressive towards the officer, a history of weapons in the home, those types of things, the officer knows that before he enters. Okay? Now, does anyone know who the young girl is up top? Yes. Thank you. Her name is Ayanna Stanley Jones. You know what happened to her? She was killed by Detroit police officers. And the specific way that she was killed by Detroit police officers was they were in the process of raiding her house and they were looking for her father. And they shot flash grenades into her house in an attempt to basically smoke out everyone in the house. And Ayanna and her grandmother Myrtilla were asleep on the sofa at the time, and the flash grenade literally made contact with the 7-year-old girl and killed her. Now, Detroit police is saying, well, you know, these cameras help us to identify violent people who are in the house, people who are suffering from mental incapacitation or could be violent or aggressive towards the officer. Right. Violent and aggressive, like a 7-year-old girl is violent and aggressive, and her grandmother. Right. So, I mean, to me, stories like what happened to Ayanna Stanley Jones is why, you know, it really makes no sense for us to listen to Detroit police when they say stuff like, oh, these cameras are making you safer, because these cameras help us to identify you and, you know, solve crimes. But, I mean, Ayanna's killer, Joseph Weekley, he's actually still on the Detroit Police Force. He was allowed to rejoin the Detroit Police Force after being on administrative leave pending Ayanna's case. So that tells you everything that you need to know about the people who are behind the cameras. And another aspect of, you know, the surveillance state that has been really creeping into Detroit was only really made worse by September 11th and everything that happened on September 11th. So we all know 9/11 was the beginning of the war on terror. And now we have both the war on terror and war on drugs, right? So we have sort of the machinery of the surveillance state that was developed through the war on drugs, and then it's taken over by you know, new agencies, new police forces like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in the war on terror. So, you know, the war on terror resulted in a number of really unconstitutional pieces of legislation, like the Patriot Act. There's another thing called combating violent extremism. Has anyone heard of CVE in the room? Okay, a couple folks. Normally when I ask that question, everybody's like, well, no, the Muslim folks in the room, no. But everybody else is just kind of like, But usually, combating violent extremism is basically a program that targets Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, and it targets them in a very specific way. It's, you know, it's supposed to be a counterterrorism program, quote, 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 because we all know that Muslims are the greatest terror threat in America and not white boys. But it's supposed to be a counterterrorism program. And the way that it's set up is the FBI approaches people in mosques or masjids, and it tries to get, kind of co-opt them into informing on other people in the mosque. And it even offers mosques themselves things like, financial incentives like money, scholarships, donations to the mosque, stuff like that, all kind of in the name of like um, giving up members of their own communities who they suspect of being terror threats. And naturally, you can kind of guess that, like, if you are, if you're an Arab American person and you got somebody who is an FBI agent who is trying to get you to give up somebody in their mosque because they suspect that your mosque is harboring terrorists, you're probably going to just get scared and say, it was that guy, right? Because I mean, that's what we all do when we're approached by these, armed agents of the state. Um, so, CVE has really kind of resulted in a lot of people being wrongfully accused and, set up in sting operations and stuff like that. But, in the Muslim American and Arab American community in Dearborn, Hamtramck, throughout the Metro Detroit area, CVE is targeting them heavily. And there are lots of informants in our mosques. Because the program started under Obama and is still going very strong under Trump, as you can imagine. And then, in addition to that, we have the U.S. Targeted Killing Program. Does anyone know about this? Few people. So, the U.S. Targeted Assassination Program or Targeted Killing Program was basically another policy that mainly began under Obama, which gave the president extra legal powers to order an assassination of an individual if that person is deemed to be an imminent threat to the United States. And that person can be an American citizen, and that has been used to kill American citizens before. One such person was named Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a U.S. citizen who was killed in Yemen because he was believed to be a violent extremist threat to the United States homeland. And the other outrageous thing that happened was after he was killed, his son, Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, and his nephew were also killed in the targeted assassination program simply because the government felt like, well, his son is going to grow up and want revenge. So as it is now, if the U.S. government deems you to be a very imminent threat to the U.S. homeland, they can kill you, and they do have the judicial power to do that. And pretty much all of this is why, surveillance kind of, it always comes with containment. It's always going to come with oppression, basically, of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, and we have to oppose surveillance if we want to oppose containment, if we want to oppose that oppression. Okay. So I'm gonna let Yana Lynn here take over and talk to you about the most recent mass surveillance program which we have right here in Detroit.
Thank you. Yeah, so basically everything Arthur said. Now we're going to talk about kind of like this program called Project Greenlight. I don't know if y'all have seen those gaudy flashing green lights you see mostly at gas stations. It is in Corktown, but y'all don't get those lights because it'll mess up the neighborhood. So you got to keep it pretty. But the neighborhoods in Detroit, outside of Corktown, we get those flashing green lights, and that's basically cameras that feed directly into the Detroit Police Department, called this real-time crime center that Arthur was just talking about, and Also, businesses do pay for those. And also, we have now, are realizing since Duggan's State of the City, they are actually on traffic lights now, and they're planning to expand that to, I think, like it was saying, 7 Mile, Greenfield, like 11 intersections in Detroit. And so they're using how they're paying for this. Well, the first round of camera, the programs, we actually, to build the real time crime center, we did take that money away from the city. I think it was what, $8 million to build this. And this money, um, we had no idea about it. There was no real vote on it. There was no, it was just like, here, we're going to do this thing. And it was like, okay, I guess. So they did that. And then businesses, yes, they do pay into it. But now, Department of Transportation, Federal Transportation is giving Detroit police 5.4 million, and then the state is giving 3.4 million from their transportation fund to include the rest of the cameras on the intersection. So I mean, I don't know if y'all been driving or if y'all take public transportation, but like, yeah, you decided to spend that on cameras when like everybody knows we have very bad public transportation. I see people riding a bike in the snow because like you cannot rely on the bus. I mean, we're bus, that's they got it going on, but the rest, you forget about it. So like to me, it just seems like there was no input from what we wanted, or if you were even able to get money from federal and state transportation, why didn't you put that towards building actual transportation systems in the city? But we decided to put up these random surveillance cameras that feed into this system, to the real time crime center. And so, yeah, so that's kind of like what we are for BYP 100, as well as other groups in Detroit are fighting against this surveillance system. And there's a lot of different things we've learned along the way. Talking to, I know somebody who works for Project Greenlight, and like how a lot of the gas station owners would just randomly call police on black kids that hang outside because they seem dangerous or threatening. And like number one, a lot of kids take the bus, so bus stops are right in front of gas stations. So what are I want to go buy something from the gas station. I'm gonna hang out with my friends. So, but now I'm a threat. And so, like, how are those cameras being putting black kids and black lives in danger all the time? We saw about, I don't know if you heard about the story of the woman in Detroit Receiving Hospital who had a mental breakdown episode, and police came and tackled her, and used abused her, brutalized her during this episode she was having. And so like things like that, when they just react, we all know police just react when they see us. Oh, they don't think about anything else. They just see, oh, you're not white, I'm going to attack because you are in this area, and yeah, I'm doing my job. So like think about how like those surveillance cameras and like constant police surveillance you know is a way of like, just like what Arthur's saying, just oppression of like marginalized people or people of color. And then we also were kind of talking about, how what other things we could spend this money on. I mean, the superintendent of Detroit Public Schools would like to put this program in schools, and they already have it in one of the technical schools in Detroit. And so, Detroit Public Schools like, wow, yeah, let's buy surveillance to put in these schools. When like, I don't know, they could probably use that money for something else, And there are a lot of kids, Detroit student activists who openly said, no, we don't want that. And then you talk to city council members like McAllister and like, whoa, I talked to those kids and we did a survey, and actually some of them did say that more police would make them feel more safe. Like, okay, yeah, because you're in the community, you talk to kids, right? No, you don't. I do though. So yeah, so it's just kind of like we've been at city council meetings, trying to get the word out, help because they ultimately make the vote on whether or not they'll make it mandatory after they actually want to make it mandatory for business to open after 10 p.m. And so we are talking always at meetings, bringing up like, no, we don't want this, we don't want this, and they're starting to, okay, kind of listening, getting maybe I don't know how much, probably not, but who knows. So yeah, I think it's important for the community to definitely show up at these meetings and like talk to a city councilor when you do your 2 minute spiel, talking about no, we actually don't want our money going towards these cameras, these speed. And then Duggan and Craig, kind of how they're justifying it is like, yeah, so in Chicago, in New York, they have a surveillance program, and it's they cut down crime by 90%, and it's just like you just say things, it's just does that even sound right? I don't know. It just 90%, like wow. No, and they also spend what I don't know. Last time I checked, $3 billion on police. I don't know if that's what we want to do. I don't think we had that kind of money, but if we did, no. So, and then we also have what Craig saying, well, these surveillance cameras have already cut down 30% of crime in these green light areas. And then someone was like, fact check. So how do you measure that? Can we see reports? There's no way we can actually measure that. I don't know why you're asking me that. There's no way we can really measure. Then why would you say it? Then don't just say stuff when somebody asks you to fact check. Like duh, but of course, I don't get paid. They don't get paid to think either. But so we're like dealing with these people in power, and it's just I don't know how they got here, but here we are fighting against that. So yeah, I just hope just ways you can plug in. We have flyers. Money always helps, when we're doing. We also want to do some protests, out here because their whole thing is Detroiters want this, and it's like actually we don't, and we should show them that we don't. So what better way to show them is come out and support that, to show like no, we don't actually want this. We also showing, like I said, showing up at city council meetings also help because city council do hold the vote for whether or not it's mandatory, and also the budget coming up, voting on the budget. So there's actually a meeting Tuesday, and I can next Tuesday I can give you information of where that meeting is. But yeah, just showing out there and making sure that our voices are heard, and maybe they'll take us into consideration. But if not, 2020 elections are coming, I believe, for city council, and hopefully, maybe we got some Detroiters that want to run because they don't know what they're doing. We also, did I mention money? Money. I think we have a little slide too. Ooh, donation link. Just like support and definitely lifting up this issue and showing up for this cause. I think we have a game coming up and more interactive and questions. Sorry, I don't have all the answers though.
I just want to kind of know from an organizational standpoint with VYP 100, ideally, what do you, since the kind of like ever-bearing presence of surveillance and how it's been targeted and who it's been targeted to, what as an organization do you guys see as a solution? Because obviously at this point, yes, you want to have people, you want to go to city council, you want to speak to these people in power, you want to try to get something adjusted, but in a more smaller scale branching out, what do you guys as an organization want to bring towards this conversation?
Absolutely. So I think one of our things, a part of our campaign is to change the culture of safety. So changing the meaning of safety. So like you talk to a lot of neighbors and they'll be like, more police is what makes me safe. But then they're like, yeah, but then they also beat us. So it's like, so let's talk about alternatives to policing, right? And like community policing, community block clubs. You talk about surveillance. How about, people watching each other, neighbors connecting and watching each other, kind of things in that way. Also, I think when people like why would they even have a surveillance, right? It's like this umbrella of criminalization of poverty. And so them thinking, well, people do crime because they think we need more police and they need to be watched. And it's like, no, so you really just think we just do this just for fun and people join gangs because it's fun. Or people do it for like food security, housing security, and like, money and survival. So like how can we allocate the budget, which is why I said the budget meaning is so important, because like more police in our budget is not the answer. We need more, that money needs to be going to more resources for our communities. And so I think those are kind of like the more immediate fixes and kind of like things that will actually bring safety to Detroit.
And have you guys had a chance and opportunity to speak with local precincts in the areas, like even areas that you reside as a Detroiter? Have you had a chance to speak with these like police precincts and kind of like with the community policing or like with I personally work with the Dearborn police officers that even working with Detroit in some type of community alternatives to, violent force or something of that sort to kind of bring that conversation to the table.
Right. No, I'm not interested in talking to police at all. And we are abolitionists, and we don't. Our job is to get rid of them. So I don't think they actually want us to talk to us about how we can remove their job. I doubt it. But definitely, as police commissioners do, because they do put in a bid for the budget, and so going to those budget meetings and like, they there and they see it. So I'm like, let me get my car after I say this one thing about y'all, and I'm gonna run because I know how y'all get down. So it's like, as an activist and like many activists in Detroit have had run-ins, and it's not cute, it's not pretty, it's not safe. I don't want to go to no meeting with all of them because I feel like that is very dangerous.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
To kind of piggyback, as someone who may not be a part of any organization like that, do you feel like it's the community members' jobs to like engage with both sides or be that middle ground between like police and different organizations who are very strong in activism?
I mean, if there are groups out there who are in the middle doing the mediation, like I said, I don't think there's anything the police can offer in the grand scheme of things. I think defunding their 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 group ultimately is the goal, and I don't think there is any middle ground with that. That's like some Democrat in the middle type stuff, and it's just for me, I don't see how it's helping anything. But there are groups doing it, and more power to them. I definitely think, talking to the community members and like people who are interested in doing block clubs and like having those community surveillance like without police involvement, I think is what I was more speaking to when it comes to community policing. Get somebody over here in the blue.
So you made a comment regarding Corktown and how you don't have those green flashing lights there. And so I wanted to know if there has been any resistance from the new white wave masses that's coming in, and if they are willing to coalesce, because we all know hyper-policing benefits them the most, but are they doing it?
I thought that's why some of y'all was here. But for real. Yeah, I don't know. There's not a lot of groups in the, white activist space that's like in the more, Corktown, Midtown, downtown area besides like gentrification-y type stuff. Like we need more, dog parks and okay, thank you. But I don't, and I'm sure maybe some of you are in those groups and want to talk to it, and that's, I just don't, I don't know.
So you mentioned that the state MDOT is appropriate about over $3 million for Greenlight at intersections. Is that money, do you know, like already sent to Detroit, or is there a chance to like work with MDOT and maybe the governor to stop that money from coming?
And that's a good question, and I'm not sure. And I know, so the Detroit News article just came out, like, I think earlier this week, and so we were trying to get more information on understanding where that funding is coming from. If it's like always, like you said, allocated, or is it something that we requested and for this particular program?
I'm gonna say like 4 simple words, and all the intellectual people here to understand, and then hopefully it's like one of my third meetings. He brought to like food security and liberation, and I would like to see some people that's white people here give some feedback. I see a lot of y'all, some of you guys have notepads. You might be here for a course. You might be here because you have shame, or you have a privilege. You have an actual privilege. Y'all see this, so-called white supremacy, but actually what it is, white inferiority complex. I know some of you guys heard of Dr. Francis Cress Wilson. Not about liberation. Why some of you guys are here, some of your parents basically got you here in the city of Detroit. You already see the gentrification going on. When you see you walking your dog and your kids, you're in the neighborhood. You know what I'm saying? Some of y'all here are here for guilt. And I see some familiar faces in here also. And you got notepads. Some of y'all got notepads. Some of y'all are here for surveillance. And sometimes they pacify and have, sometimes, I ain't saying them, but you see they have a passport, but sometimes they pacify us having black groups or other groups and fund them. Like the other brother right here was saying about giving money to the mob or the mass shit. You know what I'm saying? Like Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand call it mobs, swallow like a mosquito. You know what I'm saying? So basically, I want to hear some of you white people, white kids here, to talk and actually give some feedback. Because the gentrification in Detroit is real. The 400 years is over. Y'all got to understand it. Right here, I'm ready to die for my people. It's food poverty and liberation. That's why some of y'all here, that's why your parents got you here, because y'all was trying to take over. And y'all know that. Some of y'all right now, y'all know, I know somebody here that's informed. I was in the military. You know what I'm saying? So I know some of y'all here are informed, and some of them look just like me. How you doing, sister?
How are you?
And I know we, brother, you for liberation, the fear of Malik, and all of them. I don't know about them, but hey, we got to come together as a people. And some of y'all all are here for surveillance. And y'all know, some of you intellectual people, I say, white people, be real. I'm not going to pacify. I want to be blunt, but I'm not trying to hurt anybody's son. I'm being politically correct. We both come together. This is the most crookedest, I'm about to say, damn country in the goddamn world. You know what I'm saying? Come together, everybody. You all come from one race. You all come from the black woman. That's evident. 4 million years old. Older than that, probably. We're the first people on this earth. We are the original people. A lot of y'all people know, this is how I see some of y'all looking. Y'all already know who the original man is. I'm a god, and the black woman's the goddess. If you don't know you're defending you, a king and a queen. Black people bring it together. I'm telling y'all, people of color. Some of y'all Europeans here, some of y'all probably got guns in your car. Y'all probably easy for to kill one of us. Say so-called nigga. They say so-called the word nigga mean niggas. We are royalty. We come from a different cloth. Some of y'all here, this is what the doggone white kill. So please, one of y'all say why y'all here. And be honest and truthful. Y'all hear this here and take over? Y'all ain't gonna take over. This monster, this is why I was born and raised at. You know what I'm saying? And some of y'all, I can tell y'all got guilt. I can tell this by looking at y'all face. And some of y'all here, just looking at y'all here for the face. You know what I'm saying? And then the best, worst people in here, your homes are just like you. Y'all ain't none of y'all taking notes. If I had to die for one person or help them to elevate and bring yourself up, I can let you stand right here. Just because you break don't mean, you know what I'm about to say. You heard me what I'm about to say. Shit. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? I got, you see, I'm white skin, so you obviously I have white people in my family. You see the long nose? I got the kinky hair, and I love it. I wish I was as blue as I could stay on earth, but all we have to do is love to come together and leave social media alone, because that's the biggest thing is brainwashing and spirituality.
I appreciate your comments, young lady, earlier about community policing. I think that it's important for people to talk about the difference between law enforcement and what law enforcement does to keep safe neighborhoods and safe communities, and the difference between that and community members, leaders, or figures deciding to be community police outside of an organized neighborhood association or block club where there's still actually civil rules to how a community can do that, up to and including things that are not just considered public scare and gossip that decide to monitor or edit people outside of their either First Amendment rights or putting them into in positions that are against even consumer protection rights, which are not really quasi-privacy law concerns in stores that are in cities too. So I think that there could be some private organizations that get involved with community policing that are not just nosy neighbors. And it would be interesting to hear if there are any efforts that are organized around that issue. Because I did hear you make the distinguishing difference between law enforcement and community policing.
And there are neighborhood organizations who do they do pay for like security, unarmed security, or I don't actually know if they're unarmed, but like a little, it's like a sometimes I know in Boston Edison sometimes see like a little car going around the neighborhoods, just like slowly just watching, and that's like community paid for, and so they're not necessarily like businesses that do it. I'm sure there are, but also I get weary about that because it's all about protecting property. I don't feel like somebody's life should be in danger because you want to protect things, but you know, I think it's a good conversation to have for sure.
Yes, good evening. You guys did a great job with your presentation. I feel it was very well put together and I think very informative. And I would just say that, you know, for people who want more information about how to get involved, there is a website called NoNewJailsCoalition.org that is forming a coalition of organizations and people to raise facts. I mean, to one of the questions that you had, dear, we're like, well, what can we do we can ask for accountability, we can ask for facts. Chief Craig does not like to give facts. He likes to say he feels that this is working, which is what he told my colleague, Eric Williams, at the Justice Center. So I feel that we can empower ourselves in our collective voice by joining coalitions, and there is this existing coalition, No New Jails, coalition.org, that you can go and sign up, and you will get emails, we will have events. Our campaign coordinator, I don't see her here, but she's been here every other time and will definitely be here in the coming weeks. But, you know, what leaders need to hear are the facts. And they need to hear it from a collective voice. And I wouldn't, with all due respect to the brother here, I wouldn't separate out the race of the voice. We all care about privacy. We all care about our constitutional rights. If they don't exist on a grand scale for any one of us, they don't exist for any of us. And I've been a lawyer for 25 years, and I have seen the lack of respect for constitutional rights in policing, in the justice system, in the Court of Appeals, in the Supreme Court. It's a fight I will always fight. But your voice does matter. It does resonate with elected officials, and judges are elected officials too. So thank you.
Yeah, also a part of that coalition.
My question is, how do you guys plan to defund police organizations? Is it through like political action or like activism? And also, are you guys working with communities and their leaders to start these community watch kind of organizations and groups in neighborhoods?
Yep. So I think, like you were saying, it's both political and activism. You can't just do, activism and then they're passing a budget. I think it matters of who we're electing, and also like organizing community members to push elected officials to, okay, we have a collective budget that we want to push. Like, this is what we want our money to go towards, and this is what you need to vote on, or else, next election we'll put somebody else there, or we'll swap you out. So I think, I think it has to be both. It can't just be, one or the other. And that's why being involved in politics and going to those city council meetings are very important. And I know Duggan doesn't like any kind of opposition, so he usually leaves by the time public answer comes. So I can't get to him quite yet, but you put the pressure.
I guess I'm kind of wondering, as far as paying for agreements the property manager, is this indicative of the privatization of police, or how is this private capitalism? I guess I'm wondering, is this step one of something that y'all think is bigger? Where is this going? Because also I know that New Orleans has implemented something really similar, and they're also on track with us in terms of charter schools. So I'm kind of what do we need to be on the lookout for?
Definitely, that is a huge thing. I think this is why it's so important, because it's the first time we've ever really seen very closely. Well, this is they always get funded by random private companies, but actually businesses can actually pay for police protection. It's isn't it your job to protect everybody though? But it's no, I'm only coming for the people who pay me. We've seen that in different incidents that have happened in the city, where it was this woman who called the police and she didn't get a car come out until 4 days. Her daughter was had an incident, or her boyfriend, I think she was harmed in some way, or abducted, and she called the police and they didn't show up till 4 days. And then meanwhile, they're promising all 400 businesses this surveillance, as in car surveillance, and somehow watching 400 screens. Probably not, but they get all of the attention. It's kind of so we as citizens who, we pay taxes, and even not, we're people, and your job was supposed to, protect. I don't really know, but that was, and now it's just well, they're paying us, so we're gonna go ahead and protect these businesses, which is why I'm saying we're saying also the whole private, paying for protection. I just think it's just like you were saying, capitalizing again, capitalism doing capitalism, and us, we're gonna, we people get hit the hardest, and we're always neglected over a dollar every single time, and choose money over us, our lives. That's just, what it's come to. And I think that's this particular program is very much so, it's very scary to see that's legal. So maybe it's not. And I know some lawyers is about to sue. Maybe. You didn't hear that from me. One more question.
Yeah.
It's not a question so much as a comment. There saw a movie a couple of months ago. It's called The Feeling of Being Watched, and the whole subject is about surveillance of this entire neighborhood outside of Chicago called Bridgeview. It's a primarily Arab American neighborhood, and a journalist who lived there found out in a nutshell that she had grown up with seeing people knocking on the doors and people sitting around in cars watching her and her neighbors. But she thought it was just for a couple of people in the neighborhood. Come to find out, the FBI had her entire neighborhood under surveillance since the 80s. The assumption was that, since it's an Arab American neighborhood, that we're going to find a couple of terrorists. So they were watching literally everybody in her neighborhood, her family. They were sitting outside They've sitting outside cars, watching everybody go, constantly knocking on doors, asking people that they were suspicious of. So what she did, she and her family finally got some information about the operation. It's called the trail operation or something like that. And they finally got some information about it before you. And they wanted to find out, well, how did this go? And that's when they found out how long it was going back. Now, they did find, put under house arrest this one gentleman in their neighborhood who went to Israel and bringing some money to Palestinian relations. And so they granted him a terrorist, and they put him under house arrest for like 20 years. And then they finally dropped the charges because they realized, oh, yeah, he didn't, do any terrorist acts or anything. But they had him on lockdown, like he couldn't leave the country, couldn't leave the neighborhood, all that. But bottom line was, what's creepy about the whole thing is that you have a whole neighborhood of, and I think it's going on to this day, American citizens under surveillance by the government. They didn't even know, and even when they tried to find out, there was stuff that they still kept from them. So, but anyway, the movie will be playing at the Creek Festival April 10th. If you want to see it. And then also years ago, I was in Baltimore. I was staying there with an activist, and I was working in the neighborhood, and we're walking down the street with her, the activist I was staying with, and a friend, and there were lights flashing on top of the street lights down the street we're going to, and the activist friend said, yeah, you know what, those are surveillance lights up on each one of the street lights here, the ones that were flashing, and I'm thinking, really? Because they were all up and down the street pretty much, so the whole idea of Project Greenlight and everything, and the rolling surveillance here in Detroit, that is not new, essentially. So it's been around for a while. It's been taken in different places.
Thank you all for your questions and comments.
Yeah, so we're gonna take a short 5-minute break while we kind of like set up for this activity. So get some water, some more food, then we'll be back in 5.
All right, y'all. Let's get this activity going. But before I explain how the activity works, I wanted to know if I could get 10 volunteers to participate, because this is a large group and not everybody's gonna be able to do it. But if we can get 10 people, 5 for each team, that would be great. So if we can get 10 hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I see 9. Cool, 10. So if y'all could form 2 lines of 5, right, in front of these different grids, that's what we'll call them. So 5 in front of this grid, and then 5 folks in front of this grid. Yeah, just form a line would be vertical line. Yeah, basically.
Just straight down the middle.
Cool. Got 5. We have 5 over here. So we think we need a little more. 2 more folks on this side.
I don't know. We just don't.
Yeah, try and have some distance between the beginning of that, though, because that's key. Yeah, that's cool. All right, thanks for being volunteers. My name is Rashad, by the way. I'm another member of BYP 100 Detroit. And essentially, what this game is going to represent, I'll give the storyline. So essentially, these are 2 families. Y'all are a family, and y'all are trying to go on a vacation. Y'all are trying to pass the Canadian border, and you're trying to explore Niagara Falls, whatever in Canada that you're just really interested in doing. Maybe meeting Drake. I don't know, anything that's that your family is trying to do together as a collective. Yeah, Justin Bieber as well. Yeah, so but the caveat is that along the way there are some cameras out here, some police cameras. You have police people patrolling. You have state patrol. You also have ICE that's on the border, patrolling. And then also at the end that you have the literal U.S.-Canadian border in which you have to get questioned there. So essentially, these different sticky notes are just different spots or like nodes on a map from the beginning all the way into the end. And each group's his job is basically how all five of your folks get all your five of your folks across to the end. People go one at a time. Anybody, it doesn't have to be in particular order. You don't have to go in form of line, but just take turns and try and make it all the way to the other side. If you hit a particular spot that is a green light camera or it is an ICE agent, the person that's going to be like moderating your group, Yamisi is going to be moderating this group. I'll be moderating this group. You know, they'll say like or they'll like give you like a scenario of like what's going on, and then that person has to start over. So you have to be able to figure out what the path is, and all of the people in your family need to get through. So I'll just say like a few of the rules that kind of encapsulate it, and then we can get started. So teams must stay on their own grid. So stay on the respective grid. Only one person from your team is allowed on their grid at a time. You can only move one square at a time, and you can't jump a row. So you can move in any cardinal direction, including diagonals. So you can go up one, you can go right one, you can go left one, you can go down one, but then you can also do the diagonals, the 4 diagonals as well. But you can only move like one in that direction. Yeah, and if you move to a new square, the facilitator of your group will say like it's either safe or it's a trap. And if you land on a safe square, you can make another move. So if you land on the trap, then you have to start over. Basically saying you can keep making continuous moves as long as it's in the right direction. And this is a rule. It's kind of confusing sounding, so I'll explain it. A trap square may become a safe square if stepped on in the correct order. So basically what I mean by that is just because if you stepped on it at one period of time and it was a trap at that point, that doesn't mean later along in the path that actually may be safe. So it's a little tricky. And the game is over when everybody gets across unless it takes too long. And you can't use any props or markers besides like what you've been given. So is this clear specifically for the team folks? Is this making sense? Any questions? Any like clarification? Okay, I mean you have your facilitator to kind of get you going. But yeah, so let's get started.
So, we're going to go one by one, and then we're going to say what is, if it's a trap door, or if it's like a green light regulation, how like read a scenario that they have to go back.
And for both of them, the bottom, this bottom left square right here, that's just what's the starting square. For both of those, the bottom left. So anybody can try and start? You start, that's the start. Anybody? Good? That's the starting point, so you're good there. Let's go ahead and take whatever. Yeah, as long as the diagonal up. So yeah, that's you see, it's just that continuously until you get to the end. That's the starting point. Okay.
You make a pick stop and your friends play. If his brother's having a mental episode in the street and someone calls the police, resulting in an attack.
You mean it's one square that's
stand over a block, like square. Do you want to stand over it or in between?
In between is like, as long as I can see what square it is, you're kind of like.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's cool.
Black squad targeting sex workers don't seriously having target shooters. I just want to guess about your like Sarah's favorite recognition about we're interested in citing you as a homicide suspect, we show up when you're on the way out.
And that's EYP100. That's it. Okay. Yes, Peter, right? Alright.
I thought that was
I'll see you next
Oh, I made it.
I don't want to say things. Okay. Now, I'm pretty sure you already invested in someone get failed out.
It's 8 different combinations. I didn't try it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's
Here, I feel like I've gone to all of these from here and I've gotten filled out. Maybe we haven't done this. We did this one? I don't know where I was like,
the National Wildlife Federation.
like it's round or is it a combination? Yeah, we might need to
That's great. Just got out for not being homicidal.
But like, you know, like one of our traditions, up to scale, foraging for mushrooms, it's just like in high school. Yeah. So try to do school traditions.
So now we're focusing on watching.
Yeah, I'm excited. Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's like they get to work with them, they continue to work on things as well. It's a lot of things to come out of that, you know, so. There's like a little bit of support, and like at every school, the idea is like we're building a team. It's like community partners, all sorts of other folks. Yeah.
Yeah, y'all get like 2 more tries.
All right. One, third one in the middle. To the left. Or to the right. Yeah. Yep. To the right. And then now go up to the middle of the hand.
Yeah, so you're good.
Wait, it's slow.
You do the shot.
I have the back right here, man. Oh, sorry.
All right.
I don't think
So we need like group
no, you haven't moved the rest of yours. You just try them this one or that one.
Alright.
You can try.
Let's wrap this. No, this is
Here's our
All right, so hopefully that was fun. So either watch or be a part of this. Can y'all hear me? Oh, never mind. So like, what did y'all like notice about what was going on? Just general observations, either from the people that were actually participating or just people that were looking from onward. It was rigged. It was rigged. Why do you say that?
First of all, there's more space, there's more choices, more possibilities to eliminate. Second of all, here, just a straight line.
Yeah. So they pretty much went through like a really like narrow path on this one. I'm not sure if people were paying attention over here, but people were doing a bunch of diagonals. It was like a lot more complicated. So for any of the people that were like playing this, like, did y'all notice that?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So like, how did that make people feel when they noticed that?
Frustrated.
Frustration?
What it made me think of is like when I crossed the border of Mexico and back, like you pick the wrong line or the wrong like to go through, and you get randomly checked as to which one you got.
Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's funny that this is like bringing up memories of people's like actual like travel and comedy. Did you have something?
I was gonna say it also kind of the inconvenience factor of it, at least for my team, it was like, all right, a couple of us went back, but on the other team, they just kept hitting roadblocks. So it was like for us as a team, it was just like, all right, we'll go back, but you could see that it was general frustration on the other side. Like I cannot move, but it was like for us, it was like, that's all right.
When you like noticed them being frustrated, did that make you like think anything, or you just noticed it?
I think I was more focused, at least personally, I was more focused on my personal end goal of getting across. So it was like I took knowledge of it and I acknowledged it, but I didn't internalize it as my own. So I kept moving, which is what a lot of us do when we see other people going through hardship or going through some type of oppression of some form. Like we did it and we acknowledge it, and we don't internalize it because it's like that's not my path. I don't have to cross.
Right. It's not my backyard. Not my
circus.
Yeah. So yeah, like this was. Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if she was going to mention it, but a peer over here mentioned how this is what, if the Greenlight project continues, what it could be like for Detroiters and anywhere else that has this, has implemented this. So I just wanted to know, hopefully she is willing to talk on it and her perspective.
Yeah, I thought, I'd say maybe this time's like, okay, right now, like at the beginning, people were stepping on it and they were going back, but after a few times, it caught them. Everyone said like the one maybe back they knew was safe and go on it, but that one seemed more of like if it were to expand, like really, you can't memorize every single place.
Some way. I would like, unless somebody else wants to like add comment. Go ahead.
So something I thought, in addition to the Greenlight thing, I felt like maybe at the end, this one you're going to reveal like some demographic info about these hypothetical families.
Right.
Like I was probably the privileged family because it was a straight line, whereas this was a lot more complex.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people were kind of like hinting at this like metaphor for like just overall like systemic oppression, and this type of activity is like one way of like kind of like us being able to visualize that and like actualize that and show that like in our bodies. And like as the person over there, like in this team, like you were like talking about like how like in life you can even notice these differences happening, and like it could be a disproportional different effect for a different demographic or a different identity. But a lot of times people don't know what to like do with that. Like you were talking about privilege before. People have to like being able to like recognize their privilege, but actually be able to like make a difference. And like ultimately, this is also can be used as showing like how the disparate maps are for surveillance. If you look at surveillance for like communities of color, you'll see just these really dense dots all represented like cameras. If you look at the Project Greenlight, you'll see all that density in the neighborhoods, but barely any in the surrounding areas around here. And this is like a way of like making that parallel, that people have to go through a lot more different ways of being criminalized and their privacy being breached, whereas like other people have easier paths, whether that be literally driving to get across the border or like the literal, more of a figurative path like in their livelihood. You want to make a comment?
Wondering like if there was like a small deviation of this experiment where you took the two teams and had them take the same path, but in order to like symbolize systematic oppression, one group would have the advantage through events, and the other is, excuse my language, shit out of luck, because there is a bias in the justice system for certain groups, well, that favor them, but biases against other groups. And it's still the same community. Like, this is kind of representing two different communities, but it could still be the same community where this is happening.
Right. Yeah, and that brings up a good point. Like, it's not necessarily always just spatial. There's like spatial disparities, but also at the same time, it could be the same spatial mapping, but because of the state, the people that you're interacting with, they interact with different groups differently. So that's an alternative way of going about it.
So please, this is like my third or fourth thing. This is with white supremacy. I almost say white inferiority complex. Can one of the young college students that's white, please, can you please explain your understanding of so-called white supremacy or white privilege? Now I feel like I said, half you guys might be here for the guilt aspect of it. Or maybe an older white adult here say something that doesn't expound on it, get your understanding for the people of color.
I mean, I would just say, put it simply, it's just easier for me to do things than it is for you to do things.
Okay, and why? Do you think, you know why?
Because I'm white.
But why do you think that started? Why do you think, they say at the start by the table, why do you think they actually started this so-called privilege, just because of your European background?
I think that it didn't necessarily start at a point that's like recent, but it's, you know, you got to go back very far in history to find that point. You know?
Anybody else want to expound? Somebody like, I don't know, how old are you?
19.
So white privilege happened, or just war happened, and somebody just, and that was it.
You say it's from a war?
At least from like my side, like I was meant to like facilitate this activity. I don't know if we have other things like going on like after this. No, this is the last thing. Okay. Did anybody like? There's no like closing like announcements or anything like that. Okay. Well, I mean, if that's the case, y'all can use this open space to dialogue the origins of white supremacy, whatnot. But I guess this is like where BYP 100 like stops off. Do you have something, Yana?
Just that everyone that signed in, we added to our mailing list too, so we can see you updates on our campaign and city council meetings, and you know, just how to be involved and stuff like that.
Make sure y'all contact me on the community work. Make sure this is my passion, food sovereignty, liberation. So y'all make sure y'all contact me. If I die doing so, that's my just due. So y'all better contact me.
To your point, I think, and to Ms. Johnson's point of like, if you do trace it back, like yes, the first civilizations were people of color in the Fertile Crescent, India and China, but
India and China, no, Africa.
Yeah, Africa. But when it came to, you know, white people got lucky. When the conquistadors,
they did it by force, brute force. Be correct. Don't sugarcoat it.
No, I understand. I understand that they did do force, but they were helped by bringing smallpox and typhus and all these diseases that wiped out 50 million Native Americans. They would have not conquered the New World had it not been for them bringing this. And then, you know, the Industrial Revolution happened. It almost happened in the Tang Dynasty in China 1,000 years prior, but somehow the British, and that's. We are, you know, there's nothing special like these things about Western civilization being superior. They could have happened, honestly could have happened anywhere.
Do we have any more questions about, not to break up this debate, but it gets real philosophical sometimes. But just, yes. But any more questions about like surveillance, our campaign, or anything else? Thank you. Oh, there are some. There are some. Sometimes internalized anti-blackness is real. Especially we do talk to people in the community, and a lot of people, that's real. Internalized anti-blackness, and so I think that's where the conversations on safety come in and community conversations. There are a lot of black-owned businesses that don't have Project Greenlight, but there are some that do. A lot of them are on gas stations and liquor stores, which aren't predominantly owned by us. But that's another conversation. They're not. No, like the gas stations and liquor, like the way I was talking about, like they call like the cops on black kids for hanging out there.
And then, what are your thoughts on how there's hyper policing against Muslim communities, but yet they're also supporting this hyper policing on black?
Mm-hmm. We actually talked to a group called Take on Hate, and we actually are in conversations talking about get your people, because kind of sort of thing, because yes, this surveillance thing is, who knows who's tapping into this? ICE, what kind of FBI federal agents tapping into this kind of technology that is already there. And so how do we get groups to actually, for all of us to come together, hey, we are all being attacked by this. This is not the time to, but I don't think that's my job to sit there and tell somebody, hey, stop calling police on us, because it's more of communities getting their own communities, having intra-community conversations about anti-blackness and why calling the police on, supporting these surveillance systems can internally indeed infect our own communities, and how our own people can be surveilled through these cameras as well.
Sorry for the question. How has Greenlight Project decreased the amount of sex trafficking and organ trafficking of black people here in the city?
That's a good question. I think, first off, I think Palmer Park is the largest area in Detroit that mostly is surveilled a lot by the police for sex trafficking. I do, or not really sex trafficking, it's more like sex work. And I feel legalize sex work, number one. But also, I think there are any real numbers. If there are, I'm not aware of them, and also DPDR is not very transparent about anything these days. So, but I do. Palmer Park area is very heavily surveilled by police. You see a bunch of people out there, and all of a sudden at 4 p.m. they all gone because the cops be out and surveilling that area. And I think it's more doing more harm to people who are out there. And also, yes, sex workers are, being arrested a lot of the time, and people who are not sex workers, because even if, I guarantee if I walk down there at night and there's a police surveillance, they're going to look at me and say, look at me, you see, are you doing sex work? Why are you walking in this area? So anybody pretty much can be picked up. And when they have these hot spots, in areas of sex work, because it's kind of hard sometimes to sift through that, sex trafficking and then sex work and all that. So.
Yeah, I live over there by Palmer Park, over there, they fall in love over. Yeah. And not that long ago, somebody did get killed over at transgender. Police is not really out there like that. It's like when they sound calm down, police do a little, get them out of their area, but it's a lot of transgender and violence over there. They got a bounty hunter over there also.
It's a lot of trans women being murdered over in that area, and it's really, really unfortunate.
First of all, thank you so much for that presentation and the labor that went into presenting this to us. I've heard you guys speak before, and I love that you draw the intersections of how it affects the Muslim community and how it affects other folks. And I don't know if I missed it in the beginning of the presentation because I was a little late, but I think thinking about this from a bigger perspective, like things like the Patriot Act, get enacted because we're so numb to stuff and just we normalize this type of thing, and we think that these people are out here trying to protect us, and then we willfully let them go against our constitutional rights. And then even before that, COINTELPRO. So like these are just manifestations of these things that have already happened, and I think what you guys have spoken about and what you've highlighted, this isn't. We need to not think about this as a Black issue. We need to all be all hands on deck, trying to help and support everybody because nobody's safe. And so I really want to commend you again and just think about this on a bigger spectrum of policies that affect us every day, and we legally let them, surveil us and invade our privacy. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And we talk about facial recognition is also one of the things that Craig wants to add, if not already added in certain cameras. And I don't know if y'all know if this is funny because it's like a Snapchat filter sort of thing, but that's how I know it doesn't work on dark-skinned people. Because on Snapchat filter, I have to be in the brightest of light. That little bunny ears. I want the ears too, Well, I gotta be in the light for that. But it doesn't work very well on darker skinned people where I'm like identified. Yeah. But not for them Snapchat filters and facial recognition, which but I can be more wrongly identified if they are using that surveillance, and the next thing you know, somebody's knocking on my door because I've been tagged as somebody who I'm not, and then so that technology is not even in itself. Not only is it invasion of privacy, but can also wrongly identify people and cause people to be innocently accused and things like that.
Can I just say one more thing, just to touch on the anti-Blackness in all our communities? I'm Arab myself, and I work for a nonprofit organization that predominantly works with Arab Americans, and we're trying to highlight this issue, and it's so nuanced, and you don't even know where to start. But first and foremost, there needs to be acknowledgement, and that's something we're working on with our community, because there's Arab, liquor store owners that are poisoning the Black community, gas station owners that call the police on Black folks. So I think that if anybody is interested, please be on the lookout and follow us so that we can have this discussion at that conference and start making those connections. Some groups are already making those connections, but it just needs to be a wider conversation where we all have to look at our community and acknowledge the anti-Blackness that exists in every one of them. So I just wanted to say that piece. Sorry.
Thank you. That's all for questions today.
I just want to give another round of applause for BYP 100 and the amazing work that they've done for us tonight. I'm going to make this very short because we're running against our time limit, but I want to remind you what the next 3 programs are so you can sort of be on track and be excited about what's coming up. So next week we'll be talking about the cost of mass incarceration, and Force Detroit will be here and leading our conversations about that, which would be wonderful. April 4th, the week following, we'll talk about the new abolition movement. And we'll have the Detroit Justice Center here, amongst others, leading our discussion. And then on April 11th, we'll have Imagining New Notions of Security to be our final session together. But again, one more really wonderful round of applause to BYP 100 and our discussion night on containment. Goes without saying, be safe on the way home.